by ECIS. ECIS is the Educational Collaborative of International Schools, established for 55 years as a not-for-profit organisation. We have over 500 members in 78 countries. My name is Georgie McIntyre and I am the Chief Learning Officer at ECIS, and it is my pleasure to introduce today's webinar. ECIS are proud to be members of the International Schools Recovery Forum, alongside Together Schools and Clear Path Alerts. These series of free webinars are offered as part of this collaborative forum to support our international schools with advice and guidance as they reopen and recover. We will be sharing a recording of today's webinar, and there will be an opportunity throughout questions via the chat box. Polling questions will also be offered throughout. Apologies. Change management is the process, tools and techniques used to achieve the required outcome that necessitates a different way of working. Critical to this is the management of people through communication internally and externally. The pandemic has forced schools to close, and recovery is about how to manage this new normal effectively. This session will provide insights on how to successfully implement change through a structured approach. Please let me introduce our experts today: Greg Varner, co-founder of Together Schools, and Kerry Nockolds, Director of Admissions and Marketing at Taipei European School. Please join me now in welcoming and handing over to Greg and Kerry.
Yes, hello, welcome. Thanks for joining us today. Before we really get started, I wanted to open this up to a poll, because change management or transformation is words that are used in business quite commonly. And I'd like to get some feedback from everyone, how they feel, how you feel about change. Just give a few moments for everyone to respond to the poll. So Georgie, do we have some results here?
Yep, just sharing the results at the moment. We've got obviously 50% saying I embrace the change and 50% are apprehensive. Certainly from my perspective, I would say that I try to embrace the change, but there's always a level of apprehension about how it's going to impact us and what the concerns are going to be. Absolutely.
I mean, change is something that is difficult for many, but the question is why. If we look, through the process of our learning, when we're born with, and we're all curious, we're born with a level of curiosity and learning, and we're willing to adapt, to change, to learn. But as we learn and we consolidate those learnings, we establish behaviors, and excuse me, and that's a bit difficult to unlearn and then to learn something new. So people become confident and comfortable with what they have been doing. So we see this all the time, and it's especially relevant when you look at sports. When someone has to unlearn and then learn a new skill or behavior, it's very difficult. And that's something where it's a challenge. And people oftentimes during change doubt the benefit of what they're doing. They get fatigued and they become uncertain, and then they give up. And this is really the biggest challenge with change management or transformation. And what we see is that, the beginning for change management is very much about establishing some type of burning platform. It's about establishing the reason for what it is that is going to be changed. And the biggest challenge is really, for this whole process that may be interesting for people, is that 60 to 70% in companies, change management or transformation fails. So when going through this process, I'm going to be highlighting a little bit about what that challenge is that people are facing, you know, and what needs to be done. And if we look at the first point about the burning platform, I mean, obviously we have a pandemic. We have something that has to, you know, that has created the need for change. And what's important is that everyone is understanding and aligned for the reason for change. What is the reason? So that's really the first lesson that is learned, is what is the reason for the change? Then, after that, let me just click. We need to identify the direction or vision, including the principles for change, so the culture and shared direction. So need to establish a clear vision or guiding principle which is aligned with your school's values. And that's very critical, that it's clear why people are doing it and what you're trying to achieve with this. Then need to prioritize, and this needs to start with the leadership team, then go to an implementation team, to the rest of the school, as well as the broader community. So, excuse me, need to get buy-in, starting with the leadership team, as to what are the priorities. Then need to communicate. And communication has to be not only internally, but also externally. The staff is very important. The people within the school are important that are working to motivate and create that change. And then it's important to communicate externally to ensure that the community is confident with what is going on. So it's really important to communicate the vision and highlight success and address changes swiftly. Then it's about implementation. Here, it's not about just one person, but it's about a team. It's about working collaboratively, including the operational team, to define and implement the change. It has to be that a plan is implemented which has clear success factors, so that way you can celebrate together. Because that's one of the biggest things with change process, is this fatigue that we're doing a lot of things and are we actually achieving anything? And then finally, need to adapt. And that's something that we're definitely going to see in this environment, is that new information, government regulations, things aren't working, environment changes, and you need to embrace an open mindset and be ready to pivot. Unfortunately, this isn't the end for us in this process, because we need to look at, as I said, there's going to be regulations that are changing, something's happening. That needs to bring back to the point about communicating, or even going very back to the vision, because maybe something disruptive happens. Need to go back to the very beginning and say, what is it that we're trying to achieve, and why is it that we need to make this change? So what do we need to do now? So as I said, 60 to 70% of companies fail in this, and those are the lessons that are generally learned about the failure, is to ensure there's an understood and aligned reason for change, establish a clear vision or guiding principles aligned with the school's values, get buy-in starting with the leadership team as to priorities, and then align the vision and highlight success and address challenges swiftly. Communication needs to start early in this process, and that's very important. Implement, define a plan, and celebrate success together, and then embrace an open mindset and ready to pivot. So now I'd like to open up to the next poll, which is, does your school have the necessary knowledge and tools to change on its own? Georgie, could you put that up?
Yeah, I'm just going to launch that one now for you, Greg.
Thank you.
Here we go.
Okay, so it seems like people are pretty split on this one, between two answers. Support would be great to receive, to give insurance, and it's a daunting task, but we're managing through it. you know, the change management is not easy, and it does require, you know, support from various angles. And I think it's important, and definitely something that, you know, anyone that's going through it, any school or company, asking for help is never something that's bad. So I think maybe we can introduce now Kerry to get some real life value lessons. Kerry, I mean, I know that, you know, you've gone through a very difficult change management process and gone through the whole thing, and then had to go back a couple of times already because you've had to open and close and open and close again. So maybe you could give us a little bit of a background on what is the challenge, your biggest challenge that you faced.
Okay, well, so just as a quick introduction, I'm based in Taiwan, and in many respects, we've been very fortunate in the COVID-19 pandemic. But we were very, very close to the epicenter in China, just across the Taiwan Straits. So just to give you a timeline of what we've faced from our perspective, in late January, we had our Chinese New Year holiday. So everything was closed. And that's when the Wuhan epicenter kind of like kicked off. So we came back, all the teachers, all the students, all the families were not in the country or out and about. So we weren't in school when it all kicked off. We came back, had 2 days before we found out that the government was cancelling school for an extra 2 weeks when local schools came back. So we're an international school. We don't have to follow the local regulations in terms of when we open and close, but the government recommended that the schools stay closed until the end of February. So we had 3 weeks when we would have come back, where nobody else would have been. So we went to digital learning for the first time. It was basically our phase 1. Then we came back in the end of February, so we back to school with great hope that things would be better. And we managed to stay open until March 23rd, which was when the US and Europe really, the pandemic kicked in. And the government, all of the universities and schools across you know, the West were closing down at that stage. So lots of the Taiwanese students were coming back to Taiwan and traveling back to Taiwan. So the government said, look, there's a problem. We need to make sure that, you know, there's lots of people coming back, bringing COVID-19 back to Taiwan. And we were in a situation where that was, many of our families were linked to the returning students or returning family members from across the world. So we had to make a decision separate from the government to say we're shutting down for a second digital learning period, which we took from March 23rd until April 1st. And the difficult part there was the government informed us retroactively, saying 3 days, going back 3 days, we were like, I don't know, March the 18th, and it said the quarantine would start on the 14th. Well, that was already 4 days gone when we found this information from the government. So we had to make very quick decisions about what we were going to do for the safety and health of the student and community. So then we closed for 8 days, thinking that we were going to buy some time because we had our spring break coming on the 1st of April. And we communicated to the families and the staff, stay on island, don't go anywhere. So people took their breaks on island. We were originally coming back on the 10th of April, and then the government announced that there had been too many people in certain places locally, and there was a danger of COVID in those tourist areas. So we were then faced with, well, lots of our families and lots of our staff had been on holiday locally in those areas, what do we do now? And so we made the decision to go to a third session of digital learning. So that was our third phase. And we finally got back to school on April 20th. So we were in a much better position than many of the other schools around the world. But we had to basically go through the change management slide. If you could pop that back on, Greg.
Yes, I can. Just let me.
Thank you. Great, that's perfect. If you could go through the end. So we basically went through the change management slide 3 times within the space of 6 weeks.
Yeah.
And obviously we had
the
burning platform, because the pandemic was, you know, in Taiwan we had 50 cases in the phase 1, and then the return of a kind of a phase 2 where another couple of hundred cases came up. And so we were back to the beginning, and the vision and the rules and how we had to work, the vision, priorities, communicate and implement were all happening essentially on the same days. So we would have to do all of these things at exactly the same time. So we were setting our priorities, we were communicating and implementing simultaneously. And then having to set that up and adapt a week later and go through the priorities, communicate and implement again simultaneously. And that cycle happened 3 times. Of course, each stage we were improving our systems and getting used to the processes we were implementing. But it was an interesting process and an interesting time for the management team to be doing those things simultaneously.
Yeah, must have been a real challenge from the process side of things. If you look at this, as I said, you went through, you needed to adapt, and then have to go back and do everything simultaneously with the priorities, communicate and implement. What did you actually do from the communication point of view? Because I'm sure there must have been a great amount of frustration from, you know, parents and in your community, and you know, maybe not against you and the school, but you know, maybe not. But what did you do?
Well, I mean, the first thing was to make sure that the leadership team and the staff and the teacher faculty all understood what we were doing and how we were doing it. So you have to make sure the communication internally is clear to everybody, so that they don't miscommunicate small, you know, nuances about something that then kind of blows up into wildfire reaction from the parents. Because we were working with daily changes from the government telling us what was happening. So we would internally have to communicate with government and the like CDC to make sure we understood exactly what the government were proposing, and then we would have to put it into our own context and make sure that it fits the staff being safe and well, the students and the parents. And so we had to make sure that, just as an additional complication for our school, it's very unique in this sense, but we have a British school, a French school and a German school within the umbrella of the Taipei European School. So we actually have 4 heads of school who are communicating with their parents, their staff, in addition to the overarching European school communication method. So we had a big challenge, but one of the things that we found, and we really kind of, like, you talked about pivoting. One of the things we pivoted once we had got a unified communication was then taking that communication to the community with a Facebook campaign, and trying to leverage local media to make sure that the understanding of what digital learning was or is was being clearly communicated, because obviously at that time, and even still now, digital learning is still a bit hazy in what people understand it to be. And essentially, educators, teachers all across the world were defining and redefining what digital learning is for their students based on the context of their learning. And that was the same thing that we were doing with our 4 different schools,
Right.
4 different student bodies.
So,
So
it certainly sounds very challenging, Kerry. I mean, and clearly you've had to adapt very quickly across the various campuses. So you mentioned sort of Facebook and a campaign. Were there any other ways that you actually were able to communicate out? Was it just purely Facebook, or were there other sort of...
well, we sent out...
Before answering that, I just want to recommend to everyone, please ask any questions. We're going to be trying to answer them throughout at various points. So please go ahead. If you have any questions, just put them in the chat.
Yeah.
So sorry, Kerry, go ahead.
That's okay. So we, as a school, we have a CEO who's the head of all of the school. And we had implemented prior to this a CEO weekly newsletter. But obviously things were happening so fast, we were sending that update weekly, twice weekly, occasionally 3 times weekly at that stage, to try to make sure that at least the official understanding of how we're dealing with the situation and what we're doing with digital learning was going out. And the leadership team across the schools were coming together every single morning for talking about this for about an hour and a half every single day, to make sure that we were aligned in terms of what teachers were doing across different schools. We were aligned in the communication of the implementation stage, which was taking place at exactly the same stage as we were kind of like dealing with the communication. So implementing, there was trying to make sure that we reduced footfall on the campuses, which meant keeping parents away. So that made communication even more important, because they were not seeing what's happening inside the campus.
Right.
So we used the Facebook as a way to show lots of photos. We were taking pictures of temperature check stations for, you know, checking the temperature of the children, masks, hand washing, all the sorts of things we were doing in the implementation stage. We were taking photographs and putting them online and showing parents, this is what's happening at this very moment, to try to mitigate the dangers of COVID for this school. Right. And for your children and for the staff. So we were updating the Facebook feeds almost daily for the first few weeks. And actually that, as a consequence, it increased our Facebook imprint from the parents. They were only getting to see what's going on via what was going out on Facebook.
Right. So you definitely use
the implementation stage.
Yeah. So you definitely use different channels for communicating different things via email or via your internet, via Facebook, etc. So did that help with you know, like you said, you built up the community with Facebook? Is there, you know, any other benefits that you got by channeling the messages very clearly?
There's benefits of bringing the community together. We did have challenges with the communication, as I can imagine many schools across the world have, because bad news is not always well received.
Of course.
So we did have some fake news out there. For example, when we closed the school down for the 3rd digital phase of learning, following the announcement of the government, parents were on their WhatsApp line, you know, saying, oh, it's outrageous, teachers have gone overseas to have their holidays, when obviously we'd told teachers you can't go overseas. So we were actually being, you know, seen. There was fake news out there amongst the parents, and we would have to try to, through the Facebook, through the letters, make parents aware. WhatsApp, line, they're very difficult medias to manage in terms of the conversations that are taking place within the community. And a lot of the community was split right down the middle about whether the school was doing the right thing or not. And many of the more vocal people on these social media apps would be kind of looking at the negative side, and people who are very happy would not necessarily get involved because they don't want to be dragged into a discussion on a website or on a WhatsApp or line group. So that's where it becomes difficult communicating, but you can't really go and try to take over somebody else's group discussion. All you can do is give information as you become aware that that information is not being communicated clearly.
Yes. And that's something that companies see as well, and we've heard as well, dealing with the pandemic, you have to deal with what you know and what you don't know, and be truthful and create that confidence on what you do know, and then address how you're handling with the things that you don't know, right? And so that's important that you split that communication and create that confidence and trust that you're managing it. You know, you're creating the confidence during the uncertainty. So good job. Maybe Georgie, we can open it up now to the next couple of poll questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
On the parents and the teachers. And if we do have any questions at this stage, maybe we could answer those.
Okay, so I think the first question was what ways did you use to communicate out to your school community? So I think you kind of addressed that, Kerry. Yes. What model of remote learning did you use to adopt? Was it sort of a flipped learning approach, or what has been tried at your school?
So we kind of adapted as we were going along. So I look at it as 3 phases. Phase 1 was when we'd just come back and found out this was hitting. So the first phase was more about maintaining the core subjects. So the teachers would they would follow the same schedule as a normal week and set work online, but be available to answer emails and online. So it was a little bit more kind of set task, set homework, and then review that homework. It wasn't as interactive. So that partly was because we had to do it very quick notice, and no one knew this was going to happen. Mm-hmm. So the first week was a little bit, my daughter's in the secondary school for the British primary, and so I was watching it as a parent, and she was going on doing the tasks. It was a little bit, what's the word? It felt more like homework than interactive learning like they would get in the class. So after we finished the first phase, the leaders of the different sections basically surveyed and interviewed the kids and the parents to work out what was working well, what could be done better. And they did that during the second week of the first phase of digital learning. So when we came back to digital learning the second time, and we had a little bit more expectation that we would be coming back because everything was kicking off all around the world. And now we were a little bit more prepared, mentally at least. And we had done during the first phase of digital learning, the teachers could come into school. So we were doing training on different platforms. And we at that time took the Zoom approach like many schools in the world. So when we came back to phase 2 of the digital learning in late March, we were ready with Zoom, and we had trained the teachers to use Zoom. So at that stage, we got the kids to come on and join classes on Zoom for the first 20 minutes of the class, and they'll be using all of the functionality, like doing polls, just like this, asking quizzes, and the children were a little bit more engaged because they could see their friends, they could hear the teacher. And so the second phase was a lot more successful, as you would imagine, because you adapt and you change based on the things you've learned through the first phase.
Yep.
You have that experience from the first time.
Sorry?
Yeah, you have that experience from the first time that you can build on, right? So everything's new, and then all of a sudden you've learned something. It's like any skill. You do it once, you're not perfect, then you do it again, and you're better. So that cycle of learning, you've just kind of made it accelerate.
Absolutely. And I mean, fortunately, when the first digital learning came into effect, the school had in the past year been doing CPD for all teachers to make sure they were Google certified level 1. So we had actually been moving toward more digital learning as an organization from our, the last year or so, because we've moved and are moving toward a one-to-one device program in the school, which is a change management process which had already kind of gotten 80% of the way through. So when we did go to that first digital learning, whilst it wasn't perfect, we were in a better place than we would have been if this had happened a year and a half previous, due to the change management toward that technology and a one-to-one device program.
Right. Good.
But just to make things more interesting, by the third time, you'd think we would be really, really good.
Yeah.
We had a new spanner dropped into the works. You may have heard that Zoom had issues about protection because servers are in China. So the Taiwanese government issued an announcement to education and everybody that we're not allowed to use Zoom. So we had to leave Zoom for the third phase and pivot to Google Meetings.
Okay, so that must have been an unexpected, bump in the road in terms of this learning process and improvement. But I think it's to be expected with government regulations and things changing all the time. You need to be ready to pivot and move quickly.
And I've got to say, the teachers in our organization were just amazing. I mean, they really rolled with the changes and, put the children's education learning first, and with the goal of trying to make sure the curriculum kept on ticking away.
Yes. And that actually is a good segue into the next poll. I mean, let's just summarize this poll that we've seen. Most parents are good. There are some challenges, and you've identified how that has impacted you. And one other person in the poll said that it is unfortunately a struggle. Georgie, maybe you could open up the next poll, because that's building on what Kerry just said, which is how teachers are handling the change. From your experience, obviously, you had a very positive one, and that's very important in this change management process. So I think you've launched the poll, Georgie, so if everyone could share their thoughts on that.
Yeah, we've also got a question here about have the teachers been sharing good practice across the school, Kerry? Have you seen some good examples of that?
Absolutely. So whilst the campus was shut for each of the digital learning phases, so the campus was shut to children to make sure that they were safe. We did have the teachers coming in each week to share best practice, to collaborate within year groups to try to prepare for the following week. And it's amazing what you know, great educators can do at a push when they've got to try and find a way to do things. So some were doing more work on video, some were sharing how they're using the polling system on Zoom, as we see here with the students. And we brought in a group of IB students that had just found out that the IB had cancelled for this year. So they'd been preparing for the entire year for these exams to get ready for university. And IB, the International Baccalaureate, had cancelled them, just as pretty much every examination was being cancelled at that time. And we had a Zoom meeting where we were interviewing the kids about their feelings and their concerns. And we were doing it for a parenting magazine, a local media outlet that were looking at digital learning. And really the kids were just amazing. They were so adaptable. After the initial disappointment of not being able to take their examinations, one of the students said, well, yeah, we can't do the exams, but the stuff that I've learned, you can't take away from me.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Good attitude.
Those were the kind of, you know, and so those are the things that were coming from the kids. They were understanding of the difficulties that have been placed in their way and placed in the way of the teachers. And, you know, when you've got students who were taking it like that, as a teacher, you're trying to do your best to, you know, make sure that you're not letting them down. And that's basically, I think, what the teachers really took hold. They would be working longer days because they're at home and they're answering emails, and, you know, they just put in all the work and more because you have to do more to try to keep things going. But the children and these IB students really had a great attitude. And I think it made as a leader, having sort of seen all the things we've done, to see the students, you know, take that real positive from what they've done was great. Yeah. And actually they said during the digital learning, having them all on the screen, you know, like we have the participants, some of the quieter students felt that they were more engaged because they weren't being, you know, drowned out by perhaps the more vocal students. So there was actually some positives, very clear positives in that aspect, and that was really good to hear too.
Yeah. So just to move on with the poll, we see that generally there's the teachers are fantastic, but some are concerned about the change. And I guess from a change management process, typically you need to, you know, support and continue to communicate. Example of who moved my cheese, right? You know, there's some that just jump in and others that take some time. And you mentioned as well that, you know, the communication internally is important to support that, right? To continue to support them, to encourage them, to celebrate, you know, these are the success of what we're doing to get them on board. I wanted to move over to the vision, because I know that, you know, you said that sometimes you have to go all the way back to your vision. Could you share what the vision that you had for your school?
During the pandemic?
Yeah, for this whole recovery from the beginning.
So, I mean, we basically had two key tenets on the vision. The first, to keep all of the community safe and healthy. So to try to implement anything that we could do based on the recommendations of the government and taking it a little bit further. So that was the first tenet. Did it fit, when we were making decisions, did it fit, was it the safest and healthiest way for us to proceed? And following that, it was, how can we continue the curriculum education for the children in whatever form that would take, whether it be digital learning, return to school. We had so many discussions trying to get the best for the children, things like, you know, activities after school. We talked about that. We had you know, external coaches coming in normally, and we were looking at, is it safe that external coaches are coming in, because they would have a wider connection with more potential COVID-19 families or whatever.
Right.
So we had to look at it. We want to keep the children engaged and enjoying things, but would that put their safety and health at risk? So in the case of the external coaches, we banned them. Not banned, but we cancelled those coaches from coming in. They'll come in when this is all back to normal. And then we found we looked at ways that we could continue giving children activities, and we did it with the staff in the school. So staff were giving more of their time to, you know, take the kids to do some activities, football, you know, sports, music, but we couldn't have external. So that was where the vision was, the priority, and it took us to priorities. When you're looking at one against the other, you can't have both. We went towards health, safety, and tried to mitigate as far as possible this invisible danger. And that's the problem with this situation. It is an invisible danger, and you can't know anything, or who or where. So that was really the driving force behind all decisions, which makes it easier to make decisions. It made it easier to make very unpopular decisions that we didn't want to make ourselves. But we did have a strong message coming from the government and the Centre of Disease Control. For example, inside you could not have assemblies of more than 25 people. So that made those decisions easier to make, because we could count, okay, we can't have 30 kids together anymore, we can't have assemblies, but we have classes of 24, we're fine.
Right.
That kind of thing.
Yeah. That's what generally, from a business corporate point of view, change management is very much about making sure that you have a vision so everyone can align on it, and they know that that has to be the priority. Maybe, Georgie, we can open up to the next poll, and then any questions that may have come up.
Okay, so just while we're waiting on the responses from those polls, I think one of the questions we have here is, how did you support teachers' well-being?
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? And we, not just teachers, we try to do it as a community. So the school tries to look at everything as a community. So the counselling service actually started a well-being and health newsletter on a weekly basis. So we would firstly make sure that everybody was up to date on what was going on, as far as anybody in the world knew what was going on for COVID-19. So they had an easy entry into what was going on from the experts, which is a moving platform, as we know, but also giving suggestions of what people can do from a well-being stance. Teachers specifically, the sections or that the schools would be looking at that within their own section, within the heads and the assistant heads, to try and support the teachers. I don't actually have examples that I'm aware of, but we try to do it more as a community and to get the kids engaged. And we tried to have more activity for the children, so keeping their physical energies up, and so they're not so concerned about everything else.
Great. And I think that's something that's echoed with other schools, of course, is you got to keep everyone together in the community, and the teachers also need to be, as Georgie said, supported, because otherwise the teachers are the interface, so to speak, with the students. They're the ones that are, interacting. They're the ones that are trying to encourage and make everything feel normal now. So they need to be, confident and comfortable with what they're doing. Otherwise, it's going to reflect to the children, to the students.
And given the fact that it was digital, there was a lot of pressure put on parents because
Yes.
they had to be with their kids. So we tried to, celebrate those moments where parents show, great effort to help their kids do activities at home, and we would have parents send us in videos and pictures of stuff they were doing in their own house to support their children. But
Right.
there was a lot of pressure on the parents because they were still, we weren't closed down, so some of them were still working. How
Right.
are they going to look after the children? So that
Exactly.
was tricky for the working parents, and we had to sort of understand that whilst we're making these decisions, there are ramifications on the families that are having to find ways to look after their children at home.
Yes. And I guess if we can move on to the next point, which is on priorities. Obviously, you have the vision, and then you need to decide. And as you said, you had to make some difficult decisions, about the priorities. So, what tools did you use in order to, structure how to prioritize, or what to prioritize, and then how to go after those things that you prioritized?
Well, mother is the necessity. What's the expression?
Of all change.
Yeah. So, and as with many people in schools around the world, you didn't really have a choice. You just had to
Right.
get on and get it done. The facilities, setting up the infrastructure, going out there and buying a temperature camera, resourcing the things you need to try to set up the sort of implementation stage. We just had to go and try and find those things. And
Right.
the staff just had to pull together. We had marketing making signs and posters. We had facilities setting up hand sprays. We had the teachers teaching the kids to spray their hands with disinfectant things every single lesson. So everybody had to take on their own little role in implementing this. We did make the decision very early on to reduce footfall in the school and keep the parents on the outside of the school. So that meant changing pick-up and drop-off times. We were tweaking that weeks and weeks to try to make it easier for the parents to pick up and drop off the kids. But
Right.
that meant that more people and staff were coming in early to collect children, to take children away. But there was no way around it. In the terms of change management, it wasn't difficult to persuade people that we have to do these things. Whereas in another type of change, those impositions are a major factor in
Yes.
success and failure.
Yeah. Did you use some type of tool or anything to structure what to do to make sure? Did you have a checklist or anything that you could share in terms of? Go ahead.
We didn't have a checklist. There just really wasn't time. We were making decisions in the morning and carrying them out in the afternoons. And so, it was the difficult thing was trying to communicate all of those changes to the staff quickly enough to make things happen fast enough. So we also had difficulties a little bit with staff feeling like, well, I didn't even know this was happening. How comes this happening? But there were the normal change resisting feelings because we're people.
Right.
But because the burning platform was so burning, it helped you get past some of the resistance nature that a change management process would usually encounter.
Yes. Good. In terms of emergency planning management or some type of tool like that, were you using something like that?
Well, I mean, change management from we had just to go back a few years before the pandemic, we had started our change management about 2 years ago in terms of crisis management,
right?
Because we realized, like one of the polls before, we could get some help. We were not experts in crisis management, and we had a health and safety committee that I sat on for a number of years, and we would have the same discussion over and over again about whether the security should run and do this, and what should happen in a fire. And we would, because we weren't experienced professionals in this area, we were kind of working based on what made common sense to us, but there would be common sense discussions over and over again. So 2 years ago, I was at a conference in Bangkok, and I was worried about crisis management and our white folder that told us what to do in a crisis. In that it was just not practical in a crisis. You don't go and find a white folder and flick through the pages and then discover what you're supposed to be doing. So we were aware that there was problems and that we needed to fix it. And I was at a conference. I went to 2 or 3 sessions by the same company, which was Clear Path Alerts, to understand about what could happen and how you could deal with an emergency effectively. And that was where our change management really started. It just happened to be that we'd somewhere along the line when this happened, but the vision was to make sure that the staff were better trained for the actuality of a real emergency.
Right.
And so we actually brought a consultant to Taiwan, a gentleman called Michael Johnson, and just the previous month before, from an education stance, we had brought a child protection expert. So we brought the 2 things together, 2 separate experts, and we started a process of change management on child protection and crisis management. And that had started 1.5 years prior to this pandemic. Okay. So we had already started the process.
Right.
And that process was far more like what you have here on the diagram of change management, in that we were doing it more slowly, trying to bring in leaders, trying to set a vision, try to build the understanding of what the importance of this is. And so that was more of a similar, long-term process of management change than the pandemic itself, because the pandemic we were just reacting, but we'd gone through a process of change management, or are still in the process of change management for crisis awareness and setting up protocols. So again, we were fortunate that we had started that journey. It wasn't a burning platform, it was really a led platform from a couple of leaders, myself included, having been on a health and safety committee that was, spinning the wheel but not really making any traction. So we then brought in a consultant, and we've been working with them as a school, doing working through this, and we're still working through it. It's a in progress situation, because crisis management is not easy.
No, it's not. Maybe, Joe, given the situation on time, we can just go to the last polls, and if there's any last question, we can still fit in before I ask a final question to you, Kerry.
Okay.
So, Greg, I've just issued the future poll at the moment.
Yes.
We don't have any other additional questions at the moment, but I would be interested to know what have the main positives been for your school and your community, Kerry, born out of this terrible experience?
I think there's the feeling of resilience for the students and the teachers. You know, it's a powerful bringing together of the community, a unity to try to, you know, do the best for our kids, whatever the situation. And the children themselves, going through digital learning, had to develop other skills that we want children to develop for their future. You know, self-management, you know, as I say, resilience and perseverance, and those sorts of softer skills were in evidence across the school. Children taking ownership, parents taking ownership, teachers taking ownership, and doing the best they can do in the situations that they were presented with. We'll be very happy though when it's over, as will the rest of the world. We really did miss the community, you know, the activities that we had to cancel. We had to cancel school shows, assemblies, graduation had to be adapted. So all of those bringing together of the community to celebrate, they were lost because of the need to keep social distance. We do all wear masks on campus. There's my one. When we're together, we all have to wear masks. That was a discussion that went round and round and round in the early days, because lots of Western educators and people were not used to wearing masks. But in Taiwan, we had gone through SARS some 20 years ago. And so the need or the habit of wearing a mask was much more ingrained already. So when we finally did go to wearing masks, which was about March time, for all the school, then it wasn't such a big issue, because many parents were sending their kids to school with masks anyway, and you know, you just get on with it, and then after a few days or a week or two, you just get used to putting it on. We'll be very happy when we can take them off again, but it's not such a big deal. Yeah.
So before we close now, I just wanted to ask, you shared a lot of valuable information, insights and recommendations that I'm sure people in schools around the world are happy to receive. Do you have any parting wisdoms or knowledge or recommendation that you would like to share before we finish?
Okay, I'll share a little Chinese with you. There's an expression, Ānquán DE, which is written up on big signs all over building sites and workplaces, and it means safety first. And essentially, our experience was we had the central premise of looking after the community's health and safety. Everything else worked around as best we could to do the best job we could, but we always took that as a central premise. And I don't think you can be far wrong with that. And it did help with us to communicate with the parents and the community. We have to put your safety first.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you very much. I hand it back over to Georgie.
Thanks, Greg.
Thank you so much, both Greg and Kerry, for this sort of insightful discussion. And I think it really sort of embeds the concept of change management. And actually, we've all experienced quite an agile and you know, very iterative approach throughout this. So it's good to see sort of some kind of structure that we've all gone through, but actually you know, really genuinely sort of embedding what we're living here. As mentioned, the webinars are part of the International Recovery Forum, which is free to register. And we're looking to share and support our international schools at this difficult time and help you recover and get back on your feet, sharing best practices throughout. And we also would like to mention from an ECIS perspective that this is a series of free webinars that we're offering out to support the community. And we're constantly adding to that sort of number of webinars that we have coming up. So please keep an eye out for those as well. And I note, Kerry, that you're part of the admissions sort of side. We do have a virtual admissions conference that we're looking to move all of our conferences to virtual at the moment. Like international schools, ECIS and other organisations are having to sort of look at different approaches to education and professional development and supporting the community as we go through. Thank you both so much for today.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Timing wise, it's been quite early for a few of the schools to join us, but I do know lots of people that have registered, and we will be sharing out the webinar and the presentation afterwards, and it will be featured on the Recovery Forum and ECIS website as well, for anyone that wants to watch it or share it with their network later. But thank you, we do appreciate your time. Have a good day, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.